Hi, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass podcasts. Anarchism's our topic, and no one knows it better than our guest, Dr. Matthew Adams. As well as lecturing in politics, history, and communication at Britain's Loughborough University, he's a member of the Anarchism Research Group and co-editor of the journal Anarchist Studies. He's currently working on two books, Anarchic Values and The Ideas Factory, Radical Cultural Politics and the Anarchist Public Intellectual. Welcome, Matthew, to the Political Compass podcasts.
Thank you very much.
I think the first thing to do maybe is to clear up any confusions between anarchism and anarchy. How would you define their difference?
Well, I think I'd see anarchism as really, a classic definition is that it's a form of no government socialism. So politics that looks to the liberation of people from capitalism and the state, both of which for anarchists foster domination and inequality, including economic inequality, sexism and racism, while also limiting the opportunities for individual self-development. So it's also a rejection of the idea of anarchism as anarchy. The emphasis for anarchists is on the ability of local communities and groups and individuals to mutually agree, decide political questions amongst themselves and administer their own affairs without the encroachment of hierarchies of government of the state.
I suppose the Spanish Civil War gave us one of our best insights into how that might work in practice.
Yes. Spain certainly is the place where anarchism, compared to anywhere else in Europe, was a particularly powerful force and can lay claim to having developed into a mass movement as well in Spain. And there are a few reasons for that. I think one of them, probably the most significant, is that in the opening decades of the 20th century, the comparative size of the peasantry in Spain and their history of communal independence as well carried with it traditions of cooperation and self-help and hostility to the state in a political environment where there was a kind of tendency towards authoritarianism in state power. And for that reason, anarchist ideas found a kind of fertile bed there.
It seems to be very much a Western thing. Anarchism isn't exactly rampant in the developing world. What's particularly Western about anarchist theory?
I'm not sure that's necessarily true, really. A lot of anarchists themselves have certainly kind of constructed histories of anarchism that have emphasized the importance of developments outside of Europe as being central to development of anarchism as a political theory, as a set of ideas. There's arguments, there are elements of kind of anarchist ideas about organization and cooperation and kind of spirituality, even in things like Buddhism, for instance. And also anarchist theorists themselves have looked to examples from around the world of different types of communities who have lived without kind of traditional forms of hierarchy, such as the state. So actually, I think anarchism is far more of a kind of global movement, and the idea is developed through this kind of rich conversation between activists moving all around the world. And partly that was practical, of course, because many of them were persecuted and had to travel, had to find exile, safety in countries all over world. So I think that recently there's been a move in the scholarship to kind of break down this idea as well, that anarchism is a kind of inherently Eurocentric tradition. And of course, one of the defining features of anarchism from the start has been a kind of critique of the connections between capitalism and racism. So the idea that racism is a form of domination that comes along with state and capital.
Could we describe what you're talking about as a kind of libertarian socialism, insofar as anarchists would want to rescue the socialist movement from its liaison with the nation state?
Indeed, yes. I think libertarian socialism is another term that's often used as a synonym for anarchism, and the focus is on the ability of groups of workers or communities to develop agreements amongst themselves without top-down forms of organisation. And inherent in that, of course, is a critique of Marxism, as well as being a kind of epitome of what anarchists tend to call authoritarian socialism. So a politics that centralises control and does that often through the state.
Well, an important anarchist theorist in Britain is Sir Herbert Reed, and I blanch a little at the Sir because it seems in Congress that you should have an anarchist night.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Reed tried to pass this off as the idea that, it's very common for people to live lives defined by contradictions, but that obviously misses the fact that some of these contradictions are easier to avoid than others, and not accepting a knighthood is a pretty easy thing to do, I would say. But I think that one of the things we should do is think about Reed's legacy and his ideas and try and separate out the knighthood and the baggage that came with that. It was more of a kind of moment of weakness, perhaps, rather than something that means that we need to reject all of his ideas.
I got the impression that it was Lady Reed who had more to do with that decision.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, the story, at least in the kind of biographical story, is that Reed had or was about to have an affair, and his second wife found out about that. She was someone who was committed Catholic, and Reed had met his second wife as a result of the affair anyway, so she kind of bore that stigma, and he accepted the knighthood, arguably at her insistence. But I mean, that doesn't really, I think, get Reed off the hook for what was obviously a very clear kind of contradiction with his politics.
Let's look at some of the other characters, particularly the ones that you've been working quite intensively with. Kropotkin, an extraordinary man. He was in the Tsar's court, and he sided with the Bolsheviks, got quickly disappointed with them, and then came to Britain. Do I have the story right?
Not quite. So Kropotkin was born into the Russian nobility. As you say, he was a prince. He had a privileged upbringing, attended military academy in St. Petersburg, and was briefly a member of the court. But during his time, he grew increasingly aware of the hypocrisies, the inequality, and the kind of inherent violence of Russian society at this time, and started a journey then towards political dissidence. This initially took the form of a sort of Russian populism, basically a kind of aim, desire to live and work amongst the peasants in Russia to prepare for the overthrow of Tsardom, of the monarchy, and its replacement with some kind of communal socialism. But eventually Kropotkin arrived at anarchism, which he encountered in Switzerland in the 1870s after he had escaped imprisonment in Russia for his political activities. And this leads to a period of itinerance as Kropotkin's anarchist convictions develop. He's expelled then from Switzerland. He settles in France, but there he is sentenced to 5 years in prison for his anarchist activities. And then in 1886, he moves to England, seeks refuge in England, and he stays there until 1917, when he returns to Russia with the hope of participating in the Russian Revolution.
His Mutual Aid, written as an anthropologist, is an amazing refutation of the prevailing culture of neoliberalism, and it's an inextricable link with social Darwinism, surely.
Yes, yeah. I mean, mutual aid is probably Kropotkin's key contribution. The theorization of mutual aid is his key contribution to the anarchist traditions. I mean, he makes several, but this is probably the most enduring. And there's a few contexts that are worth kind of reflecting on there. One is that Kropotkin's arrival in Britain means that his days as an active revolutionary were over in the immediate term. Britain didn't have a particularly deep anarchist movement at that point. He basically helping set it up himself. And so what Kropotkin does is that he increasingly turns to scholarly activity. And one of his key ambitions is placing anarchism on a supposedly scientific basis, reflecting his broader scientific interests. And in doing this, Kropotkin was really influenced, I think, by two theorists in particular. One is the English liberal political philosopher Herbert Spencer, and the other is the French sociologist Auguste Comte. And Kropotkin's aim was to create, like Spencer and Comte, a synthetic philosophy. So that's a kind of philosophy that brings all forms of knowledge together to unite them as a whole, as a kind of whole analysis of society and science and their history. So it's a kind of unity of the natural and the moral sciences, as someone like Kropotkin would have understood them. Like Spencer and Comte, Kropotkin thought that there were clear political conclusions that stemmed from this synthetic philosophy. But he thought that both Spencer and Comte were wrong in the political conclusions that they had drawn from their studies of societies and science. So for Kropotkin...
Are you referring to eugenics there?
Partly, yes, but also just a kind of political authoritarianism that came along with, that he saw in Comte, and in Spencer a kind of commitment to the free market and a free market form of liberalism that Kropotkin didn't see as a part as where his scientific observations should really have taken him. For Kropotkin, it pointed instead, this synthetic philosophy, to the rejection of the state, favour of local and communal organisation, and communistic exchange on the principle of the old adage of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And mutual aid is a key part of that. That's one of the key expressions of this scientific concern. And mutual aid is basically the idea that cooperation and mutual protection are essential to the survival of the species, and that those species where individual competition, the kind of fight for life between individuals, had been reduced to a minimum, had the best prospects for evolutionary advancement. So for Kropotkin, this applied to the whole animal kingdom, to humans as well, and that progress, kind of intellectual development and individual growth depended upon how widespread cooperation was in a particular species. So this, as you kind of said at the start of the question, this is often presented as a correction to social Darwinism, to the correction of thinkers like Herbert Spencer, for instance. And that's obviously true in the broad sense, but I also think that gives a slightly wrong impression, because Kropotkin saw himself as very much following in Darwin's tradition. Darwin was a figure that he revered, that he saw as a part of this synthetic philosophy that Kropotkin was developing, and he thought basically that Darwin's legacy had been misunderstood. But out of books like On the Origin of Species, there'd been a tendency to misread it as just seeing perpetual violence as the reality of nature, and that actually Darwin had emphasised as well the importance of cooperation in evolutionary development. So yeah, this idea that it's against this reading of the natural world and human societies as well as seeing them as a war of each against all. Rather, it's a war of species against all the kind of vicissitudes of existence, the struggle to survive against hostile environments, and in that struggle, it's cooperation and not mutual warfare that's key.
I noticed that Oscar Wilde described Kropotkin's life as one of the most perfect ever lived. And yet Kropotkin himself did have his paradoxes, didn't he? He supported Britain in World War One.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. The Kropotkin support for the Allies in the First World War has been viewed in a number of ways. For some anarchists, people like Emma Goldman, for instance, she argued that it was a great shock to her, his decision to support the Allies. But others, like Rudolf Rocker, the German anarchist who was also living in Britain and ultimately spent the war in imprisonment as a German alien in Britain, thought that actually, if you looked at Kropotkin's philosophy, if you understood his character and his contributions to the tradition, that it was that the seeds of his support for the Allies were there all along. So there's a few ways of viewing it, but traditionally the kind of dominant reading has been to see Kropotkin's position on the First World War as a kind of expression of his Francophilia and his Germanophobia. So his love for France and his hatred for Germany. France as the home of the Paris Commune, of the French Revolution, of Proudhon, where Germany is the home of Bismarck, of Hegel, of Marx, kind of inherently authoritarian, centralizing, imperialistic political system. Yeah, so that's the kind of traditional way of understanding Kropotkin's support for the Allies. But I think there's actually a more complex case there, because really his support for the Allies is a reflection of the broad philosophy of history that he developed, his understanding of the historical process. And Kropotkin saw the historical process as basically a kind of undulating pattern, a pendulum perhaps, that swings between periods of reaction, where authoritarianism and centralization are dominant in human societies, and then periods where liberty and independence and individuality are more assertive. And if you look at Kropotkin's broader philosophy of history that he sets forth in books like Mutual Aid, he sees this kind of pendulum between reaction and liberty swinging throughout history. So in the barbarian, as they were called at the time, and as he used in kind of knowing quotation marks, in barbarian village communities in the ancient world, he argued that actually what you see there are various forms of cooperation in action, perhaps forms of communist exchange as well. But then they were ultimately replaced by the imperialism and centralizing qualities of the Roman Empire. You have the same with the medieval city-states, with their kind of traditions of communal independence, their kind of vibrant cultural lives, healthy and powerful workers' guilds. But then this period of creativity and widespread liberty, it swings the other way as well. It's replaced by the divine right of kings, of state building in the 16th and 17th century. Now, it's a comparatively simplistic theory of history. It's much more kind of simple reading of history than, say, historical materialism. But it really, I think, casts light on how he understood the First World War, because he saw Germany as a place that was the home of Bismarck and Marx, as inherently authoritarian and centralizing. He thought that the triumph of Germany in the First World War would set back the path of socialism for decades to come. And that in that context, even though the Allies, Britain, France, were far from perfect, as they were still states, they were still led by capitalist interests, that they afforded comparative liberties to people like Kropotkin, someone who was a political exile, that wouldn't be afforded in Germany, and that victory for Germany would kind of stymie progress for the foreseeable future.
I think probably now we should move on to some of the other figures. You mentioned Emma Goldman, and she was an incredibly charismatic figure in the labor movement in New York for a time, wasn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. Described by J. Edgar Hoover as, I think, the most dangerous woman in America at one point. Very charismatic presence, and promoter of anarchist ideas. And one of her key contributions was emphasizing the thread of women's issues that anarchism had a kind of distinctive response to, and the importance of that to a broader anarchist tradition.
Yes, she famously said, didn't she, that women didn't have to keep their wombs open and their mouths closed.
Yeah, it sounds like it could well be Emma Goldman, yeah.
Right. And Emma Goldman, somewhat surprisingly, had a great passion for Nietzsche.
Yes, yeah. And this is something that Nietzsche kind of crops up now and again in the anarchist tradition, promoted by some anarchists. Reed, for instance, who we mentioned earlier, was someone who was quite who drew on Nietzsche, and for I suppose one of the things that it points to is the relevance of kind of elites to anarchism. So Goldman, as much as she was kind of committed to socialism, was someone who still recognized elites of talent, kind of aristocracies of talent, and might be particularly creative individuals, for instance. There's something that could be celebrated and something that could emerge in anarchist context, and that's Reed kind of followed in that tradition too, in the sense that he thought anarchism would be the kind of perfect system in which real kind of aristocracies of talent would emerge, that wouldn't have any kind of formal power over anybody else, but would be kind of celebrated as great artists and individuals, but that wouldn't carry with it any kind of particular power. But it does bring out one of those tensions in the anarchist tradition about the kind of role of the individual, and perceptions of elites, and drawing on Nietzsche.
So there isn't always very much hope in anarchist theory for the masses. It's more enlightened individuals or small groups, isn't it?
I think it depends what anarchists you look to, but the general assumption, certainly for the classical anarchist tradition of people like Kropotkin and Goldman, was that it would be necessary for kind of enlightened individuals to spread their ideas, but then ultimately meaningful social change would only come about through mass revolutionary action, not through not just through the actions of elites. So it was a kind of necessary moment, really, in the kind of promotion of anarchist ideas, a necessary tool for the promotion of anarchist ideas, focusing on the actions of small groups of individuals. But the hope was always that this would spread into a much broader social revolution.
And with reference to Nietzsche, he did say, didn't he, that the state is the coldest of all cold monsters.
He did, yeah. But Nietzsche said a lot. Nietzsche said a lot of things, which has always been a problem for those who are trying to kind of shuffle him into the anarchist tradition. And I think this is a position that Reed ultimately arrived at. That he was drawn to Nietzsche for the the kind of power of his aphorisms, for the rhetorical power of the phrasings that he used, but it wasn't. Nietzsche didn't offer a kind of overall philosophy for anarchism because of the emphasis on a kind of conventional understanding of elitism, not one in an anarchist context.
Matthew, I know that the First International included several anarchists, and subsequently they didn't attend. How did anarchism fall out with Karl Marx?
Well, the split in the First International really comes down to the conflict, the clash of personalities between Marx and the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. It was a clash of personalities, but also a clash of ideas. So Bakunin's vision of the International was one that would remain federated in structure with a great degree of regional autonomy given to the national sections and the local sections of the International. This reflected elements of his political philosophy, the emphasis on kind of localism and federalism that's central to anarchism, but it was also a way to kind of maintain anarchist presence in the International, because he knew that anarchism was an important force in Italy, in Switzerland, in Spain, for instance. And Marx, in contrast, had a different vision of the International as an organization that would benefit from centralization and professionalization to engage capitalism. And it's that conflict between that vision of political centralization and a more top-down hierarchical control and local autonomy and federation that is at the heart of the debate, the conflict between Marx and Bakunin in the context of the First International.
I wonder about the relevance of anarchist theory today, because none of these great figures that you're mentioning could have envisaged a world where economic power had transcended political power. And in our globalized age of neoliberalism, the nation state is really less of a target for progressive people than the role of multinationals.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting critique. I think that, obviously one of the central things about anarchism is the critique of economic power itself. So there is the critique of capitalism that remains a significant part of the anarchist tradition. Also, I'd say that perhaps the diagnosis of the weakening relevance of the nation state might have been overstated to some degree. Just need to look at the rise of populism. Very much carries with it a vision of the nation state at its heart. So that, I think, suggests that this connection between capitalism and the state still remains very important, and anarchists would see that critique of the state as remaining particularly significant. And you see that also in the context of the coronavirus pandemic with, kind of vaccine nationalism and so forth.
Well, I wonder about COVID too, because it seems that younger people are very critical, and rightly so, of the systemic failure of governments and institutions to cope with the situation. And probably a lot of them are thinking that the Bill Gateses could do it much better.
Possibly. There's two kind of interesting ways to think about the coronavirus pandemic, really, but reflecting on anarchist principles. So one of them has been a critique of the principles of anarchism, to say, well, look at how vaccines were developed, how the organization of that was rolled out was rested on state power. So for some people, I've developed this argument that actually the role of the state in the context of the pandemic shows the kind of weakness of anarchist principles, how anarchist ideas about rejection of the state are no longer applicable. But the other side to that, of course, as you kind of indicate, is that mutual aid has reappeared as a kind of buzzword to describe forms of organisation to meet actual needs when the state has been perceived to fail around the world. There are tons of mutual aid groups developed, and it shows actually that the kind of community response, local organisation, the idea of kind of focusing on helping your neighbours and developing these kind of solidaristic relationships remains incredibly important. So I think you can draw different assessments from the pandemic about how this impacts on the claims of anarchist politics.
If you look back to the demonstrations in Seattle in 1999 against the World Trade Organization's ministerial conference, there were some anarchists who seemed to be demanding that the hated nation state claim back its autonomy from the corporations.
Yeah, I mean, well, anarchism has always been a diverse tradition with competing sets of ideas and actors and movements. But in that case, it's the privileging of the critique of capitalism over the state, and an argument that while the state is obviously not something that anarchists look at with any respect, has the potential to at least provide some security in against rampant capitalism. So it reflects perhaps a more kind of gradualist approach to understanding of anarchism, the idea that disappearance of the state is the long-term goal, but there might be different routes to getting there, and it's not going to be revolution. And in the immediate term, getting the state to provide some functions, some protections, provide certain social needs is an important thing, whilst other types of relationship are developed, essentially.
I wonder whether the flawed human species are good enough to be able to function well in a utopian socialist society if we just aren't good enough to work that out.
Well, I think someone like Kropotkin would argue that obviously the tendency towards mutual aid would suggest that people certainly are capable of living in cooperative forms, and he saw human morality developing out of the kind of evolutionary principle of mutual aid. But I suppose the other thing that a lot of anarchists would argue is that an anarchist society would still develop institutions, different forms of institutions. It would develop different forms of decision making, different educational arrangements would help create the kinds of individuals that could make an anarchist society work. So there's a learning process in all of this. You see that in Kropotkin writing about the concept of revolution, for instance. He sees the kind of virtues, the qualities that he thinks are essential to a functioning anarchist society developing in the experience of revolution itself. It's the things that people need to do to meet a crisis, cultivate different ways of doing things, cultivate different relationships between people, and would, for him, ultimately create a new world.
Well, we've seen strains of anarchism in a great many figures who would claim to be anarchists, and I suppose in some ways they are. Mahatma Gandhi, Noam Chomsky, Thoreau with the civil disobedience, strains of anarchism, but not exactly anything that Proudhon would necessarily wholeheartedly endorse.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, anarchism is a capacious tradition. By definition, it's broad and accepting. And policing the boundaries of political traditions is always difficult because ideas shift in the light of historical circumstances. Theorists themselves aren't consistent. Ideas blend into one another in hybrid forms. And anarchism has been particularly susceptible in that context. There's things that are picked out in particular theorists as being expressions of anarchism, and there are certainly echoes and continuities in someone like Gandhi, in terms of the focus on direct action and communal organisation and local decision making, that certainly echo the anarchist tradition.
That's a good point to ask you about anarcho-capitalism, so-called, because Proudhon, property is theft, he said, would hardly recognize anarcho-capitalism as being remotely attached to anarchism. How did that come about, and what sort of confusion is it causing among the public?
Yes, I think it is causing some confusion, both the appropriation of the anarchist term by anarcho-capitalism and libertarian too, which is a term that was pioneered on the left. I think the key here is a historical distinction between what's sometimes called social and sometimes called individualist forms of anarchism. So social anarchists, people like Kropotkin, emphasized humanity's latent social qualities and stressed forms of economic cooperation and distribution, things like communism, for instance. Whereas the individualist tradition, which was particularly strong in America, with people like in the 19th century, with people like Benjamin Tucker, Josiah Warren, Lysander Spooner, stressed the primacy of the individual, and they were anxious that social anarchism, with its emphasis on communism, might foster new forms of social domination, the loss of individuality because of social conformity, and the loss of individuality because of the emphasis on communal economic systems. I mean, it's worth noting as well that social anarchists advanced a similar critique there of the individualist tradition. They said that individualist anarchists favoured contractual forms of relationship that were as vulnerable to the same kind of power asymmetries that occurred under capitalism, and that would also allow hierarchies to re-emerge. And in the 50s and 60s, some theorists, notably Murray Rothbard, who claimed for a brief time that the anarcho-capitalist label, he's someone who's influenced by Austrian economics, and started to use that anarchist capitalist designation, or libertarian, to describe their form of political economy, which essentially rested on the idea of a totally liberated free market, absolutely free from state intervention, and argued that that was the best guarantor of social progress and stability, basically a kind of pure form of laissez-faire economics. And the appropriation of anarchism by this strand of thinking, what anarchists tend to call right-wing libertarians, has been particularly controversial, as you noted. I think there are probably two reasons why this is particularly controversial. One is that it rests on a selective reading of what anarchism means. It really implies that anarchism is only really defined by its rejection of the state. But the historical anarchist tradition rejected all forms of domination, of class, gender, racial domination, and it saw the state as the protector of this in partnership with capitalism. Those things work together to create these forms of domination. So it's not as if just liberating the capitalist system is going to lead to social progress or kind of society that anybody would want to live in. And the second problem there is the relationship of anarcho-capitalists to American individualists, the individualist anarchists in America, people like Tucker and Spooner, in that those individualists were generally critical of capitalism as well. I mean, they were committed to ideas of free market, but it wasn't a free market in a capitalistic form. They were opposed to unearned income, things like rent on private land and through rent and the private ownership of land. And they were really critical of what they saw as the inherent kind of exploitation at the heart of capitalism. And like social anarchists, they saw that relationship between capitalism and the state as symbiotic and deeply problematic, because the state propped up monopolistic interests and ensured class domination. So while the individualists did favour a form of free market, it was not an image of a market on the kind of capitalist model that anarcho-capitalists would stress, but something quite different. So there, I'd suggest that anarcho-capitalism at best sits very uncomfortably with the historic anarchist tradition, and the overwhelming majority of anarchists throughout history would think the same.
I'm afraid we've run out of time now, Dr. Matthew Adams, but thank you for some really fascinating insights, and I think cause a lot of people to get hold of your book, which we have in our bookshelf on Political Compass. Let me just leave you with one last question. Given the anti-authoritarian strengths of anarchism, how would you write in an acceptable language, keep off the grass?
That's a good question. I think I would have a sign that points out the preferability of staying off the grass and allow people to make their own decisions, which they would do, presented with the reasons for doing it.
That's a great way to end it. Thank you, Matthew. I hope we can talk again. Bye.